Rudolf Barshai was one of the great Russian conductors of the 20th century. A pupil of Shostakovich, he studied under him and remained a close friend and colleague for the rest of his life. And his works as a conductor, when he conducted all of Shostakovich's symphonies, has been highly regarded and is still available for sale today. But his other project, which was the one that I looked into, was his arrangements that he made of Shostakovich's string quartets, which he called these Chamber Symphonies. And it was because Barshai had established the Moscow Chamber Orchestra in 1955. He founded this orchestra and directed it for more than 20 years. And this was an ensemble that was hugely respected by Shostakovich, so much so that he allowed them to premiere his 14th symphony. And when Barshai wrote to Shostakovich and asked if he could make an arrangement of his 8th quartet, Shostakovich said, so long as the performance is as good as the performances that you give with the Moscow Chamber Orchestra, then I will allow it. And so Barshai got to work, and Shostakovich insisted that the score was sent to him when he finished it to check that he was happy with it. And at this stage, Shostakovich was very ill, and he was in the Kremlin hospital. And so Barshai sent the score to the hospital, which was essentially his home for that particular time. And he greatly approved of it, and he really admired the work that Barshai had done. So much so that he actually said that Barshai's arrangement was better than his own original work in the quartet version. And so Barshai, of course, was inspired by this and went on later in his life to arrange 4 more of the quartets. So he arranged the 1st, the 3rd, the 4th, the 8th and the 10th quartet. And my recording with the Dmitri Ensemble is of the versions that he arranged for string orchestra. So that's the 1st, the 8th and the 10th quartets. Shostakovich was so pleased with the 8th quartet arrangement that he even allowed it its own opus number. So the opus 110a, as it became known, is this chamber symphony. And the 8th quartet is arguably the most celebrated of probably of all the Shostakovich quartets, but particularly of the arrangements that Barshai made. This is the one that's really gone into the canon of string orchestras and chamber orchestras alike. The 1st and the 10th quartets are slightly less well known in the chamber versions, but this disc brings them together, and I hope that it brings them to a wider audience. The 3 quartets are individual in their styles, and the most famous, the 8th quartet, is full of quotations from Shostakovich's other works. You hear extracts taken from the 1st and the 5th symphonies, from the cello concerto, from his opera, Lady Macbeth, which up until that point had been banned from performance. And in addition, in the 2nd movement, for example, you hear a quotation from his 2nd piano trio. And in amongst all this is woven Shostakovich's musical motif, DSCH, the initials of his name, which in German notation, the notes D, E flat, C and B natural. And that opens the quartet, and you hear these 4 notes mysteriously played by the cello, and they work their way, they permeate their way through the quartet, through its 5 movements. People often over-cliche the fact that Shostakovich, his work is often related to mortality or to depression or to the fact when he was writing this quartet, he was said to be thinking about suicide. But actually in this particular quartet, it's almost as if Shostakovich is inviting us to consider those things and actually to draw parallels with his own life, with all these self-quotations and with these very morbid themes of death. So the 2nd movement, for example, is a really violent scherzo, which was a genre that Shostakovich perfected over his lifetime. So the 3rd movement is more than a nod towards Saint-Saëns' Danse Macabre, with a very sinister type waltz. And in the 4th movement, he quotes a Russian folk tune. And all of this really gives a rather dark and bleak quartet. But as I say, it's Shostakovich almost making us draw parallels with his own life and with the themes that he creates in his music. The first quartet that he wrote back in 1936 was a real exploration of the quartet genre. He hadn't written any before that. And so subsequently you have a first movement in sonata form, a second movement, a theme and variations. He's kind of trying his way through different types of music. It's very sunny in its outlook, completely different from the Eighth Quartet. And Barshai gave it a subtitle of Eine kleine Symphonie, partly because of its structure, but also I think because of its suggestion of neoclassical writing. And the fourth movement finishes with a very exuberant finale. It's in C major, the simplest of keys. The 10th quartet is, by contrast, a very substantial work and written at a time when Soviet composers were looking much more towards modernist or avant-garde music. But Shostakovich came to that a little later in his life, and at this particular time, when he wrote it in 1964, was still very much writing in this expressive style that he'd developed over the last 30 years before that. And you hear that in particularly the outer movements of this quartet, a very hesitant, individual writing, almost introverted writing. And in the middle movements, you have a very expressive passacaglia in the third movement where the theme keeps on repeating itself. And again, another violent scherzo, really terrifying music in the second movement, which really comes to life in Rudolf Barshai's arrangement for string orchestra. So I set up the Dmitri Ensemble back in 2004. So it's been 10 years since its first concert. And in that very first concert that we gave when I was a student at Cambridge University, we finished the program with Shostakovich's Eighth Quartet, arranged by Rudolf Barshai. And so the Dmitri Ensemble took its name from Dmitri Shostakovich. And we've recorded a number of discs over the last 10 years of mostly English composers, often first recordings of works by composers such as James Macmillan, Giles Swain, Vaughan Williams, and previously unrecorded Vaughan Williams, Imogen Holst, the daughter of Gustav Holst, and various collaborations with one of my other ensembles, the choir of Clare College in Cambridge. But I wanted to really record particularly the Eighth Quartet in the Barshai arrangement. And so I started to explore the other arrangements that Barshai made and thought that a disc of those string arrangements would really be an interesting thing to compare that very well-known quartet with those that are perhaps lesser known. And the 10th anniversary of the ensemble's founding seemed to be a good time to do that. And that's really how we were formed. And so to be able to record this music and I hope bring it to a wider audience is really what we exist as an ensemble. We often do repertoire that is perhaps lesser known or less frequently recorded or performed, and it's been a great pleasure to record these works and to make this recording for Harmonia Mundi. One of the great things when we were recording the work in London was the fact that, of course, many members of the ensemble exist as members of their own string quartets. And so when we were recording this repertoire, it was familiar to many of them, of course, in the quartet repertoire. But when recording these works in these fuller, more kind of monumental arrangements that Barshai made, we had to work as an ensemble in ensuring that we didn't sound like 8 string quartets, but of course we sounded like one unified whole. And the excitement in doing that was evident from all of the players in front of me in the fact that we really worked together to create what we hope is a thrilling sound of string players joining together to create a string orchestra and bringing to life what Barshai did so successfully, in my opinion, in these scores by making something that was originally rather intimate and perhaps rather small into something of a much bigger proportion. And I hope that that comes across in the recording when people listen to this disc. Barshai is very faithful to Shostakovich's quartets, And in terms of the notes, there's very little change. They're almost identical in terms of the notes that Shostakovich wrote appear in Barshai's arrangements. But what you do get in these versions for string orchestra is obviously a much fuller sound, a much greater texture. And for me, the beauty of what Barshai does is sometimes using the full sound of the orchestra, particularly in those very loud scherzo movements, with the addition, of course, of a double bass, which we don't have in the quartet, to really get a very robust, edgy, earthy sound. But by contrast, at points taking it back to solo instruments, so you hear almost like the original quartet. And so for a listener in these arrangements, you have a much broader palette than perhaps you might get within just the 4 instruments of the quartet. It's interesting in the first quartet, and this is a brilliant example of Barshai as an excellent orchestrator. He writes a part for optional celeste, which we chose to include on the recording. It's the one piece that doesn't have just string players. And it's an ingenious moment of orchestration. The celeste plays, I think, 10 bars in total, but it just adds that little extra sonority that you don't get in the original quartets. But he is very faithful to it, and it's worth remembering, of course, that Barshai went to Shostakovich for advice on orchestration, particularly on 2 of his other projects, which were the completion of Mahler's 10th Symphony and also of the orchestration of Bach's Art of Fugue. And those 2 composers were hugely influential, of course, to Shostakovich as well as to Barshai.